All right, again, so we're talking about a 200-year period from 1500 to 1700. And we've used the chat, we've done that. Okay, so back in 2017, in October specifically of 2017, the Protestant world celebrated the 500th year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. This is just a picture here of Martin Luther and some colleagues. And Martin Luther was a German, he was a monk, he was a priest, and he was a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. And one day he nailed on the door of a church 95 statements that were called theses. And he had actually done this a few months back. He'd nailed them up. He nailed some different ones up, some statements up, and he wanted to invite other academics to dispute with him, to debate on these statements. But and he wrote them in Latin, because all the academics spoke Latin and talked Latin and wrote in Latin. So he put them up on the door, and nobody took him up on the invitation to debate. It was a big yawn. A few months later, he did it again in October of 1517. Again, theses that he wanted to debate with other professors. But this time, somebody actually translated them into German and circulated them, and it created such a stir that all of Christendom was involved in the consequences. Like, that is all of for Christendom, that's like all of Europe. This second set of theses that he nailed have been called the 95 Theses. And Luther himself titled them the 95 Theses on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. Do you remember, we mentioned briefly what indulgences were in the past, and this was basically something that was given to you for whatever reason that would serve as forgiveness for your sin, or as a way to get somebody out of purgatory sooner. In this case, they were actually selling the indulgences. You would buy a piece of paper that granted forgiveness or release from purgatory for a loved one. I showed you this when we met last. This is Pope Leo X, one of those Renaissance popes, and he wanted to renovate St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And he had this giant fundraising campaign. And one of the biggest things he did to raise money for this was this selling of indulgences. So preying on people's desire for forgiveness, or to get their mother or whatever out of purgatory sooner, spending their hard-earned money on indulgences. And a monk by the name of Johann Tetzel was a Dominican friar who was the one sent to Germany, where Martin Luther was. He was sent there to sell these indulgences. And he had some pretty shady sales tactics. And it's reported that he said something like, as part of his sales pitch, quote, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." So really preying on people. So protesting these indulgences, which we saw in the chat, as someone thought of that when they thought of the Reformation, protesting selling indulgences was Luther's jumping off point. But the implications were big. It wasn't just the selling of the indulgences, but the implication was that only faith in Christ could save you, and only Jesus granted forgiveness, not some purchased indulgence or the Pope. Well, to make a long story short, Leo, the Pope, read the 95 Theses, and he sent a papal bull to Luther. Now, remember, the papal bulls, they're just sort of like official statements, official letters that popes would would send out these official proclamations. So he sent a papal bull to Luther telling him to stop saying these things and to recant or risk being excommunicated. And when Luther received the bull, and this is just sort of indicative of Luther's personality in general, when he got the bull, this proclamation from the Pope, he burned it. Well, he was called to a council and was going to have to stand trial. And this is pretty scary stuff, because I don't know if you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about John Huss in Bohemia. He was also called to a council, and they ended up throwing him in prison and burning him at the stake. But Martin Luther had a protector, the ruler of a part of Germany called Saxony, by the name of the ruler there was named Frederick III, or Frederick the Wise. He was Luther's protector, and he got Luther to the council safely. And they had the trial at the city of Worms in Germany on the Rhine. And at the trial, Martin Luther was ordered again to recant, to take it back what he had said in those theses. But Luther refused, and he said this. He said, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. So I have to be convinced by scripture. I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me." Amen. And I'm sure that he said that, may God help me, with a lot of emotion, because again, we're still in the time period where the penalty for heresy was death. All right, so he didn't recant. He was excommunicated from the church and condemned as a heretic. Frederick, his protector, got him out of there. It was quite a dramatic thing, but he actually managed to get Luther out of there and back to one of his own castles hidden away. So Martin Luther spent a lot of time sort of isolated, hidden away here in this castle. And while he was there, he translated the Bible from the New Testament from Greek to German. And remember John Wycliffe? He translated the Bible from Latin into English. And both of them had some time on their hands, because both of them had been sort of taken away from their jobs. Wycliffe hadn't been declared a heretic, but he couldn't teach at Oxford anymore. And here's Martin Luther, he's declared a heretic. So he kind of has to kind of lay low. So he translates the Bible to German. And he also poured out all this other writing attacking the church. And he really widened his target. He went from just the indulgences, and he just went wide to the heart of all the church practices and teachings. So there were actually three other strands of the Reformation. So Luther was one strand. So he was in Germany. Another strand happened in Switzerland. And here we have a man named Ulrich Zwingli, and he was in Zurich, Switzerland, and then John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. And John Calvin was actually a French Protestant who was invited to come to Geneva to help them set up a Christian state in Geneva that would be governed by church authority and church rules. So even with the Protestants, you see that idea of, the church and the state still kind of stuck together. But he set up a government in Geneva that would be run according to Protestant, biblical understanding. And it was very, very strict. Okay, the Protestants rejected all the Catholic sacraments except for baptism and the Eucharist, but they disagreed amongst themselves about those two things, about how to interpret them. And the Eucharist, the understanding of the Eucharist actually caused some huge fights between, especially Luther and Zwingli. They were just, adamant that the other one was wrong. Zwingli said that the bread and the wine were simply to help us remember. Luther, on the other hand, said he rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation, but he said that the body and blood of Christ were present along with the bread and the wine. So he believed in the actual presence, Luther did. And Zwingli said, no, it's just to help us remember. Calvin said about the Eucharist, Jesus' body was in heaven. It could only be in heaven, so that the Eucharist was some sort of spiritual feeding of us by the Holy Spirit. So kind of in between. It wasn't just to remember, it was an actual spiritual feeding, but it wasn't the actual presence. Okay, so they got into these big fights, and they got into fights about baptism too. The third strand of the Reformation were the Anabaptists, and this is not the same as Baptists. This is something different. So the Anabaptists rejected infant baptism. They only believed that believers of adult or children who were believers could be baptized, and they were also completely against anything that had the church and the state together, like Calvin was doing in Geneva. They wanted complete separation of church and state, and they were also pacifists. And this picture here on the right is just an adult baptism, but that's in a later period. I couldn't find a picture of the Anabaptists in the time period that they were in to begin with, because all I could find was pictures of them being martyred. And that's because everyone, the Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, everyone hated the Anabaptists. And this picture up here on the top left is a woman her hands and feet are being tied, and she's going to be thrown into this river to be drowned. A lot of them were drowned and martyred in other ways. It was just pretty astonishing. They felt like that they were called the Anabaptists because it meant rebaptizers. They felt like everybody else except the Anabaptists thought that this baptism was for infants. This bottom picture here on the left, I came across this a lot, and I looked it up, and this is actually a picture of the man in the ice is somebody who had arrested the man who's standing on the firm ice, and he was taking the man on the firm ice, who was an Anabaptist, taking him to be tried and executed, but he fell in the ice. But the Anabaptist didn't run away. He went and saved him and pulled him out of the ice, and he took the Anabaptist man to be tried and executed anyways. It was pretty shocking. And I don't really, I know somebody will say, or might ask me why was this? And I don't honestly know why they were so hated and persecuted and killed. But the fourth, so we've got the Lutherans, the Swiss Reformation with Calvin, and we've got the Anabaptists. And the fourth strand of the Reformation was actually Roman Catholicism itself. And remember that, as we've talked about the Roman Catholic Church through all of the Middle Ages, they were constantly reforming and renewing. There were periods where the papacy or the monasteries would go into decline, and there would always be renewal movements. And there was one actually going on. The popes at this time, all those Renaissance popes who were so corrupt, There was actually reform movements going on inside the Catholic Church at the same time. They weren't just trying to reform in response, although there was that too, but they were also reforming on their own. They really reformed in terms of their practices like they had in the past, but they doubled down on their theology and their doctrines and their liturgy, the way they worshiped and the sacraments and all that. They didn't change any of that. It was just the type of reform that we've seen in the past, where they've corrected corruption and misuse of clerical offices and that sort of thing. Okay. You can't even count the number of books that have been written about the Reformation. It's since it happened until now, that people are still writing books about the Reformation. But like the schism that happened in 1054, remember when the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox split officially? That now we have another great split, another great division, where we have the Roman Catholics and the Protestants splitting. And that's one of the themes. We're going to look at some more about that division between Roman Catholics and Protestants. We're going to look at some more of the outcomes of that. But what I wanted to share with you also is another theme, that within Protestantism itself, there was ever increasing diversity, even from day one, right from the start. And I just want to briefly share this diversity of thought and theology, even among the early Protestant reformers, and kind of see where kind of help us see where we came from in this tree. So let me share some more. Okay. So just in terms of some theology here. So in Germany, we have Martin Luther and Lutheranism, which is a denomination that exists, is well known. They believed in infant baptism in the same sort of way that the Catholics believed in it, that there's some sort of regeneration that happens when a baby, something real happens to the baby's soul that's tainted by original sin when the baptism happens. They believed that the body and blood of Jesus is actually present with the bread and the wine. And with Lutheranism, there's a lot of similarities still with Catholicism in their worship. So Martin Luther went a certain distance, but other reformers went a further distance. In Switzerland, we had Zwingli and Calvin, and they believed that infant baptism was a sign of a new covenant, that it replaced circumcision of the old covenant. So they believed only in infant baptism, and it was a sign of that baby whose parents were part of the covenant, were the baby was now part of that covenant community. The Eucharist, they were mixed. Some of them were like Zwingli, and then in that the Eucharist is just to help us remember. And some of them were a little bit more like Luther, like there's something about the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. These out of Switzerland, we get Calvinist theology and we get Reformed churches. So anytime you see a church that has a word Reformed in its name, or in its description of it, as it being a Reformed church, it's coming out of Calvin's theology. And in that Calvinist theology is the theology that the Puritans brought over to to North America when they came over here, which we're going to learn all about next week. And they brought that theology, and they set up different denominations that we recognize, like Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and they had the same theology, except for the way that they believe that churches should be governed. Like Congregationalists believe that all members have a vote, and Presbyterians believe that the church is run by elders, presbyters who make the decisions. And then we have the Anabaptists. Again, adult baptism as an outward sign of an inward change. And for them, the Eucharist is absolutely just for a memorial, for memory. And these are, the Anabaptists evolved into denominations or groups like the Amish and the Mennonites and the Quakers. Some more developments. So the Anglican Church of England is, and I'm going to talk about the English Reformation in a minute, but the Anglican Church is the Church of England. And they, there was a battle in England between Catholics and Protestants, and it got pretty bloody. And Elizabeth I, and I'm going to get into more details here, but Elizabeth I created the Anglican Church, which was kind of a middle ground. She tried to find a middle ground. And that's the Church of England. And the colonists who came to North America and settled more in the Virginia area were Anglicans coming from England. When the colonists got to the point where they wanted to revolt against British rule, the Anglican Church, the people that were part of the Anglican Church decided to call themselves something different. They call themselves Episcopalians. That's where that came from. Okay, so we've got that, the Anglican Church, and many of the English didn't think that the Anglican Church, they felt like it still had too much Catholicism in it because Elizabeth tried to find a middle ground between the two. I'm going to get into that some more. So there were some people called separatists and various groups of separatists who wanted to, they thought that the Anglican Church had too much Catholic stuff in it, and they just wanted to just go off and do their own thing. There were others like the Puritans who also thought it had too much Catholic, but they wanted to stay in it, in the Anglican Church, and purify it. So that's that. And then we have Baptists, and these are not the Anabaptists. The Baptists started appearing, people who believed that, adult baptism is the way to go. That's when people should be baptized, when they make a confession and they believe. And Baptists, that particular theology of that sacrament popped up in some of the Anglican churches. It popped up in some of Calvin's Reformed churches. So it kind of was one piece of theology that came in different places. So you can see things just sort of like diverging and different pieces of different ones combining. It gets pretty complicated. And then we have a man named Jacobus Arminius, who was from the Netherlands, and he taught against Calvin's theology, particularly Calvin's theology of predestination. So according to Calvin, before creation, God predestined a chosen few for himself and predestined the rest to damnation. Arminius said, no, humans have free will to choose, but God foreknows who will choose him. And that's what predestination means. It's based on God's foreknowledge. This was in the century after Calvin, but the people who were Calvin's followers came up with an acronym to try to summarize their Calvinist theology in contradiction to Arminius. So they came up with this acronym called TULIP. And just quickly here, and this is sort of a, if you just thought of Calvinist as TULIP, it's not very, I don't know. It doesn't give Calvin his due, because Calvin has some amazing stuff and amazing writing. But he did believe in predestination for a chosen few. And so these people who were these followers of Calvin who wanted to fight against Arminius came up with this. And T was total depravity, which means man is man, woman, humankind is utterly depraved and dead. Unconditional election means you are chosen according to God's sovereign will. That has nothing to do with you. Limited atonement means Christ died only for the elect few, not the whole world, just for those who were elect. Irresistible grace means if you're one of the elect few, there's nothing you can do to resist it. And P, perseverance of the saints, means if you're in, and there's nothing you can do to lose your salvation. And again, that's the gist of the theology that the Puritans brought to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In the 1700s, we see the rise of Methodism, starting with John Wesley, and they believed Arminius's teaching that that people have free will. They believe that you can't find the way yourself. God has to show you the truth by his Spirit, but once he shows you, you have the free will to choose or not to accept or not accept, and then you're saved by your faith alone. And both predestination and free will theology are alive and well and kicking in the world today, both of them. Whenever you see a church that calls itself Reformed, that's where you would see the Calvinist theology and predestination. I'm going to stop for questions after I do this slide, after I finish this one. Another thing that developed in Germany was something called pietism. And this was this idea that if you were a true Christian, that you could point to some point in your life where you had this struggle with your sin, and that there was a crisis and a decision to start a new life in Christ, and that your life thereafter would be this constant progression of holy living and sanctification. Really, what's different here is this idea of this feeling that there's sort of like a conversion moment or a specific time, and then there's this constant growth in sanctity after that. And this really influenced John Wesley and the Methodists. They believe, at least they did when it was a new movement, that you could keep disciplining yourself and reach some sort of perfection in this life. And this also this pietism influenced evangelicalism. And evangelicalism in the 1700s, we see the rise of this, and it's not a denomination, but it's an approach that crossed various denominations. And we're going to look a lot at that and when we get to the United States Christianity class. So we've been looking for the past several minutes here at the theme of diversity in Protestantism from day one. And it's creating this new world in which individuals need to exercise their individual judgment as to what kind of church to belong to. All right, so again, remember, we've talked about diversity. I want to go back to that division again for a little while. So we've got the Protestant Reformation produced a house divided in Europe. So we already had a house divided between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Now we've got a house divided in Europe between Catholic and Protestant. And again, we've got also at the same time, we've got the idea of nations growing. So England as a nation, France as a nation, and like Amanda reminded us with the German language, Germany's growing as a nation. and and with their strong monarchies. And the monarchies are I mentioned this before when we talked about that they were beginning to intervene in the affairs of the church and whatever. It got to the point at this point in time where it's evolved to the monarch's right to establish the religion of those in his territory, in his country, and his nation, or whatever. And this division between Catholic and Protestant in general created a lot of violent confrontation, and it created confrontation within countries, within one country, and between countries in Europe. So I want to just give you a quick case study of conflict inside of one country. Whoops, that's the slide I want to use there. This is the English Reformation, and it's an incredible case study of bloodshed within. So over here on the left is King Henry VIII. He was Catholic. Everybody was Catholic before the Reformation. And so the English Reformation is happening in that same time period, 1500 to 1700. And Henry VIII got upset with the Pope, and he cut England off from the Pope. And he sort of started bringing in the Protestant Reformation, closing monasteries, that sort of thing. He didn't really completely give up his Catholic way of worship, but he had his son educated by Protestant teachers. I think he knew that what was coming. So after Henry VIII died, his son in the middle here, this fine young gentleman here, Edward VI, he had been raised as a Protestant, and he had a strong Protestant faith and was leading England ever more fully into Protestantism. But he didn't live long, unfortunately. He died very young. And his half-sister, up here on the top right, Mary, took over. And Mary wanted to bring Catholicism back. And her nickname is Bloody Mary. And she persecuted and martyred and killed a lot of Protestants, including Protestant leaders. A couple of the two main Protestant leaders she had burned at the stake. Tracy told me she stood where that actually happened in England. So Bloody Mary. Her reign didn't last too long, 5 or 6 years. And then another half sister down here on the bottom, Elizabeth I, a daughter of Henry VIII, took over. She is Protestant, but again, I mentioned her before. She wanted to find a middle way, kind of a compromise. She created the Act of Uniformity in the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And again, we saw that with a lot of Protestants, it was still too Catholic, and probably there were Catholics still in the country who weren't satisfied either. So sometimes when you try to make a compromise down the middle, you don't make either side happy. But that's how we have the Anglican Church. And then over the next, century, we have rising in power of Puritans who wanted to purify the Anglican Church, and other times where the Puritans are persecuted, and we have a time of civil war. And we have a time when the Puritans were in the ascendancy, and they actually beheaded a king. So bloody experience of division between Catholics and Protestants in within one country here. Between countries, we have what's called the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. And this began as a religious civil war between Protestants and Catholics in Germany, sort of like the English, but it eventually encompassed all of Europe, the 30 Years' War. And there's complex intertwining of religious and geopolitical motivations. And it was one of the longest and most brutal wars in history, the 30 Years' War. And at the root of it was this religious motivation. It ended in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, and with that treaty, that was the end of the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, which had been in existence since the 800s with Charlemagne and him getting crowned. No more Holy Roman Empire. Those nations were now sovereign to determine their own religions, and nations had the legitimate right to practice Protestantism. So that was the end result of the 30 Years' War. Let's talk about the consequences of all of this religious warring. It really moved Europe towards secularization. People thought, if religion causes this, people started looking for some common ground where they could, like, what's the most base thing here we can all agree on, so we're not killing each other. And they found it in something called deism in the 1600s and the 1700s. And deism is this belief in the existence of a supreme being who creates the universe, but then has nothing to do with it, doesn't interact with humankind. There's no revelation, no miracles, no nothing. Just he created the world. We're going to talk about deism because deism is happening in the 1600s and the 1700s, also the Enlightenment. This is happening at the same time that America is forming. Deism plays a big part in the thinking of many of the founders of our country. Okay, so we've got this deism, and deism is actually part of this bigger intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, again, can Christianity really be a credible basis on which to build a society? So we're going to turn away from that, and we're going to focus completely on reason and rationality, and that's what we're going to build on. And we move from, and I'm going to give you the quick history up until today on one slide. So we have the Enlightenment, and actually out of the Enlightenment thinking, we get the American and the French revolutions, which we'll get into some more. And then we get into the period of modernization, like the 19th century, where people started thinking that reason and science are going to solve all of our problems, and mankind is going to progress and things are going to get better, until we hit the 20th century and we have all these atheistic ideologies and totalitarianism and total war twice, and all that optimism of the modernist period is lost. And then in the 1960s, we start to see another shift, and we're in 1960, and we're still in the middle of it, so we can't really assess it yet, but a shift started that's as great as anything that we've looked at so far in the history of Christianity. And who knows what's going to happen in our generation or our children or our grandchildren's generation, but there has been a huge shift, and the missional environment, which I've mentioned many times in this class, how it's shifted over time. The church's missional environment since the 1960s has dramatically changed, and I don't think we quite know. I think we're still in a state of retrenchment and not knowing how to be the church in this new environment. But that's for another talk or another topic. So we're going to take a look at the Protestant Reformation really contributed and almost made the modern world. We're going to look at a little bit of theology, church practice, and socially, politically, even we're going to look at marriage and family. So let's first look at some theology and church practice. And just a review, and these things are going to sound familiar to you. So the Protestant Reformation relocated spiritual and theological authority to Scripture. And the reformers were appealing to the revelation of God as the final arbiter of truth against the claims of papal authority, papal infallibility from Rome and Catholic tradition that might have conflicted with what the Bible said. Secondly, the Protestant Reformation challenged how people gained right standing with God. So here, salvation depended exclusively on God's grace, in contrast to the late medieval structure of penitential deeds, the things that we've seen before, things that could be performed in order to absolve you of your sin or shorten your time in purgatory. And the Protestants call that salvation by works. And you're familiar with that expression, probably. The Protestant Reformation made liturgy and church services accessible to lay people. And you know that for centuries, the church had worship had been conducted in Latin. But now we see the Reformation translating the Mass or the service into various local languages. The priests stopped wearing those special elaborate garments. The bread and the wine were available to be shared with anyone who wanted to participate. And these moved the people from being passive witnesses of the Mass to active participants in worship. The Protestant Reformation affirmed the immediacy of God's presence through the mediation of Christ. So for centuries, lay people were taught that the holiness of Christ was made him unapproachable, and they would have to get to Christ through mediators like the saints that they would pray to and the priests. But the Protestant Reformation believed and taught the priesthood of all believers, and that everybody, every individual, had access directly to Jesus, who was our mediator to God. Jesus was the mediator between us and God, and there were no need for priests to mediate, and no need for saints and to be prayed to. So the individuals have direct encounter with God. Individuals receive and evaluate truth. There's this real democratization where the clergy aren't the only actors now. The Protestant Reformation made the Bible accessible to lay people. Again, we've talked about the fact that the Bible before this had only been available in Latin. But that began to change. Remember Wycliffe translating in the 15th century the Bible to English, and now Luther in the 16th century translating it into German, making it accessible to people who wouldn't be able to read Latin. And finally, the Protestant Reformation helped propel the spread of literacy across the continent, because one of the primary emphases of the Reformation was on your own personal piety based on your appropriation of Scripture. So you needed to know how to read and study and interpret and learn the Bible yourself. And the Protestants got a reputation or a nickname of being the people of the book. Okay. See, I'm pretty sure most of that would have sounded familiar to you, as you know, the Protestants that we are. Just to show you some contrasts, some other pictures that we've seen in the past. So first of all, architecture. This is an example of a Reformed church somewhere in Europe. You can see this basic, I mean, it's got a little steeple there, but basic, simple structure, functional, compared to those massive Gothic cathedrals that we looked at pictures of a number of weeks ago. And here's the inside. No pictures, no crucifix, no statues, no nothing, just a place to sit and a place for the sermon. In terms of art, so the Protestants, they had a fine tradition of painting and art, but it just wasn't inside of the church. But these two pictures here, the one on the left is from a Rubens, who was of a Catholic tradition, and the one on the left or the right is Rembrandt, who was a Protestant. So just a little difference in the Catholic music and painting was a little bit more, and their cathedrals, everything was just a little bit more glorious and grand, and the Protestants a little more subdued and simple. Both of these are beautiful, but just a little different. And then in terms of singing, so out of the Protestant Reformation came just waves of hymns, of hymn writing, and they were written in a way that people, the whole congregation could sing. And singing wasn't just being done by specially trained choirs, up at the front of the church. Now it was everybody in the church could sing, and the music wasn't impossible for them to sing. So this was a huge change. And preaching became the center of the worship service, and the pulpit was usually placed up high like that. And for the first time, think about this, from the first time and this is worth thinking about, and not just assuming something here. This is something to think about and question. For the first time in the history of the church, the Eucharist is not the center of the worship service. It's the preaching by the preacher. Food for thought. Okay, let's look quickly at how the Protestant Reformation made the modern world. And these are consequences. So everything that I've been showing you so far, Luther, Calvin, they would have appreciated all of this. So simple worship, simple buildings, the preaching, the music, all of that. But there were also some other further down the road consequences that weren't intentional. And we're just going to look quickly at these three. So the first is free inquiry. So it's the idea that nobody can compel anyone else to think something. In the end, no intellectual authority can force you to think that you're wrong. There's nobody who stands authoritatively between you as a human being and God. And that's Martin Luther's great insight. And that refusal to accept human authority over other people's minds is something that he established despite himself. He wasn't out to create some age of intellectual freedom, but nonetheless, that's what he produced. And secondly, this idea of democracy or democratization, and not that Luther or Calvin were believed or even had the concept of democracy as a form of government. They would have probably been horrified by that notion. But the idea that the individual believer has a right or even a responsibility to stand up against a tyrannical or anti-Christian ruler is implicit in Christianity from the beginning. It led Protestants who really wanted nothing more than to live in peace into a series of religious wars and revolutions against leaders with whom they could not live on religious terms. And then finally, the idea of limited government. It's the idea that no ruler, no matter how legitimate, has jurisdiction, only has jurisdiction over outward things, over practicalities, over people's bodies, but not over their souls. And there are certain spheres where the authority of the government simply doesn't apply. And it creates a sense that even the godliest government should be strictly limited in the amount of authority it can exercise over people. So this combination of free inquiry, democratization, limited government, that's pretty much what makes up the liberal market democracies that we live in. And it runs the modern world. And it's at least in big part, a distinct heritage of Protestantism that held these together and contributed to the modern world. And it was definitely unwitting. So Martin Luther didn't want people to be free to think whatever they wanted. He wanted them to be free to believe the truth. And he assumed that the truth would be self-evident to everyone who picked up the Bible and read it. But he discovered very early on, Martin Luther did, that to his horror, there were people who were reading the Bible in wildly different ways, sometimes discovering messages for themselves in the Bible that were much more socially and politically radical than he anticipated. But it inaugurated this tradition of using the spiritual insights you gain from a direct encounter with God through the words of the Bible that you're studying to stand up against human authority. And it goes right back to the beginnings here of Protestantism. Okay. So a huge trigger for Luther was celibacy. He just thought that was absolutely wrong. And he elevates marriage as the most godly state, and all the reformers did. For adults, marriage is the most godly state, not celibacy, which it had been in Catholicism. And for the reformers, the well-ordered family established by marriage perfectly mirrored the divine plan and allowed for the best possible spiritual environment. And as monasteries and nunneries started closing, either of their own choice, or sometimes they were closed by kings or whatever. So, but there were a lot of them closing, and monks and nuns just sort of out there all of a sudden. And Martin Luther had almost like a dating service, hooking up monks and nuns so that they could get married. And he was one of the last ones, but he actually also married an ex-nun, a former nun. So the family was the model for all of the right relationships in society, with inferiors connected to superiors in a chain leading ultimately to God. And women were elevated as a spiritual backbone of the family, but as submissive to the husband. Basically, the family became the center of religious life. And unmarried people were expected to live in a home with a family, not alone. And the family becomes the confessional unit. So the father determines what, I said individual has to choose which church you're going to go to. Are you going to go to the Calvinist church? Are you going to go to the Lutheran church or whatever? So the father decides, and the whole family goes in that direction, that church. In the family is where you get all your theological instruction. It's the devotional unit where you pray together and are spiritually formed. And as a husband, you have a public role, and you have a private role as the protector and the teacher of your family. And this is when the nuclear family starts to come into being, the nuclear family of mother, father, and children. And the language about family shrinks. So prior to this, the family was thought of as belonging. We're a group of people who belong together. We're a family. It starts to shrink down to biology. We are married, and these are our biological offspring. This is our family. Kind of shrinks. And as a nuclear family develops, you start to need economic viability. You need to have a house for this family to be in. As a man, you need to earn enough money and save up enough money to buy this house and equip it for whatever you need for living. And so people started waiting a little longer to get married. And also, so this is when you start to, so there's sex outside of marriage, prostitutes, adultery, any sexual thing you can think of has been going on since the beginning of time. But now we have this new thing that people are starting to talk and think about, and the church is starting to talk and think about, premarital sex between a man and a woman who are intending to get married, but they have to wait a long time save up now. So we start to have this idea of, what do we think and do about this? Another thing Protestant took off the table were any of the saints, and I've mentioned this, any of the saints who had actually been role models for Christians. And where are the role models now? And especially for women. So all their feminine heroes are gone. All the Catherine of Siena and the Hildegard of Bingen, they're all gone. And in the Middle Ages, women had a lot of choices. They could be a nun, they could be a wife, they could be a beguine, they could be an anchoress. There were a lot of different things that women could do. But there was a curtailing of the female imagination with the Reformation, because it left, without any of these other options, it left the role of helpmate as the only ideal of Christian womanhood available. And to fulfill this role, a woman needed a husband to help and to obey. Another outcome was, if you get rid of all these role models and it's all about the family, then if the home is a holy place, then the pastor's home and family becomes the model. And in the Protestant tradition, the pastor's family is open to scrutiny as the right of the congregation. And that is a truckload of pressure. And if the performance of the pastor presents the model of spirituality, then that pressure can lead to some false living, because you want to keep up appearances. And I just want to show you, my last slide here is some imagery of Martin Luther's family. And these are images actually from the Victorian period, which is way past Luther's time. But the imagery of Martin Luther's family as the ideal family, as the model, continued to be put in front of people for centuries. We're going to see some more about these new ways of thinking about marriage and family, how they continue to play out as we move into the colonists and then the new American Christianity. So the Protestant Reformation was a tsunami, an absolute tsunami of change that we still feel 500 years later, for better, for worse. And I did add actually 2 more slides on here that I got from a webinar that I attended last Tuesday when we didn't have class on the state of global Christianity. But I just want to show you two statistics kind of slides. This is, as of 2020, these are the world religions today. And you can see Christians make up 32% of Christians across the world. And Muslims 24%. They've got agnostics included in here, and even atheists. So that's world religions today. Here is global Christianity, my last slide. The pink outer ring there represents people who identify as Catholic. Out of all the Christians in the world, 49% of them identify as Catholic. That's the whole world, South America, Africa, everybody, everywhere. And 23% self-identify as Protestants.